大家好啊，到咗讀你聽嘅時間。今日就繼續讀 A.Christie 450 from Paddington 第七節。上回講到呢，就係呢個 Lucy Sparrow 就表現出佢嘅責任心啦，嘅使命感啦。咁唔單止冇令到 Miss Marple 失望啦，揾到個女屍出嚟啦，報埋案嚇。仲咧同呢啲警察探員講咧，話佢想留喺呢個 Crackenthorpe 呢個家族嘅莊園度繼續佢嘅家務助理做事有始有終。咁亦都希望咧佢呢一個臥底身份啦，唔好俾 Emma Crackenthorpe 知道咧，因為畢竟係 Emma 決定要請佢嘅。Anyway， 咁就即係都幾完美咁塑造咗 Lucy 呢個角色啦。咁我而家繼續睇下案情發展啦，睇下警察嚟到啦。相信警察嚟到會點樣去查案呢？Lucy 又會有啲咩作用呢喺當中？好啦，我哋繼續 Chapter 7。We'd better have the yard in on it. Is that what you think, Bacon?The chief constable looked inquiringly at Inspector Bacon. The inspector was a big, stolid man. His expression was that of one utterly disgusted with humanity. The woman wasn't a local, sir, she said. There's some reason to believe, from her underclothing, that she might have been a foreigner, of course, added Inspector Bacon hastily. I'm not letting on about that yet a while.We're keeping it up our sleeves until after the inquest. The chief constable nodded. The inquest will be purely formal, I suppose. Yes, sir. I've seen the coroner. And it's fixed for when? Tomorrow. I understand the other members of the Crackenthorpe family will be here for it. There's just a chance one of them might be able to identify her. They'll all be there. They'll all be here. He consulted a list he held in his hand. Harold Crackenthorpe.He's something in the city. Quite an important figure, I understand. Alfred, don't quite know what he does. Cedric, that's the one who lives abroad. Paints. The inspector invested the word with its full quota of sinister significance. The chief constable smiled into his moustache. No reason is there to believe the Crackenthorpe family are connected with the crime in any way, he asked.Not apart from the fact that the body was found on the premise, said Inspector Bacon. And of course, it's just possible that this artist member of the family might be able to identify her. What beats me is this extraordinary rigmarole about the train. Ah, yes. You've been to see this old lady, this Miss Marple. Yes, sir. And she's quite set and definite about the whole thing.Whether she's smarmy or not, I don't know. But she sticks to her story about what her friends saw and all the rest of it. As far as all that goes, I dare say it's just make-believe. Sort of thing old ladies to make up. Like seeing flying saucers at the bottom of the garden and Russians agents in the landing library. But it seems quite clear that she did engage this young woman, the lady help, and told her to look for a body, which the girl did. And found one.observed the chief constable. Well, it's all a very remarkable story. Marple, Miss Jane Marple. The name seems familiar somehow. Anyway, I'll get on to the yard. I think you're right about its not being a local case, though we won't advertise the fact just yet. For the moment, we'll tell the press as little as possible. The inquest was a purely formal affair. No one came forward to identify the dead woman. Lucy was called to give evidence of finding the body, and medical evidence was given as to the cause of death, strangulation. The proceedings were then adjourned. It was a cold, blustery day when the Crackenthorpe family came out of the hall where the inquest had been held. There were 5 of them, all told. Emma, Cedric, Harold, Alfred, and Bryan Easley, the husband of the dead daughter Edith. There was also Mr. Wimborne, the senior partner of the firm of solicitors who dealt with the Crackenthorpe's legal affairs. He had come down specially from London at great convenience to attend the inquest, They all stood for a moment on the pavement, shivering. Quite a crowd had assembled. The piquant details of the body in the sarcophagus had been fully reported in both the London and the local press. A murmur went round. That's them. Emma said sharply, let's get away. The big hired Daimler drew up to the curb. Emma got in and motioned to Lucy. Mr. Wimborne, Cedric and Harold followed. Bryan easily said, I'll take Alfred with me in my little bus. The chauffeur shut the door and the Daimler prepared to roll away. Oh, stop, cried Emma. There are the boys. The boys, in spite of agreed protests, had been left behind at Rutherford Hall, but they now appeared grinning from ear to ear. We came on our bicycles, said Stoddard West. The policeman was very kind and let us in at the back of the hall. I hope you don't mind, Miss Crackenthorpe, he added politely. She doesn't mind, said Cedric, answering for his sister. You are only young once. Your first inquest, I expect. It was rather disappointing, said Alex, all over so soon. We can't stay here talking, said Harold irritably. There's quite a crowd, and all those men with cameras. At a sign from him, the chauffeur pulled away from the curb. The boys waved cheerfully. All over so soon, said Cedric. That's what they think, the young innocents. It's just beginning. It's all very unfortunate, most unfortunate, said Harold. I suppose. He looked at Mr. Wimborne, who compressed his thin lips and shook his head with distaste. I hope, he said sensatiously, that the whole matter will soon be cleared up satisfactorily. The police were very efficient. However, the whole thing, as Harold says, has been most unfortunate. He looked as he spoke at Lucy, and there was distinct disapproval in his glance. If it had not been for this young woman, his eyes seemed to say, poking about where she had no business to be, none of this would have happened. This statement, or one closely resembling it, was voiced by Harold Crackenthorpe. By the way, Miss Icebarrow, just what made you go looking in that sarcophagus? Lucy had already wondered just when this thought would occur to one of the family. She had known that the police would ask it first thing. What surprised her was that it seemed to have occurred to no one else until this moment. Cedric, Emma, Harold, and Mr. Wimborne all looked at her. Her reply, for what it was worth, had naturally been prepared for some time. Really, she said in a hesitant voice, I hardly know. I did feel that the whole place needed a thorough cleaning out and cleaning, and there was, she hesitated, a very peculiar and disagreeable smell. She had counted accurately on the immediate shrinking of everyone from the unpleasantness of this idea. Mr. Wimborne murmured, Yes, of course. About 3 weeks, the police surgeon said, I think, we must all try and not let our minds dwell on this thing. He smiled encouragingly at Emma, who had turned very pale. Remember, he said, this wretched young woman was nothing to do with any of us. Ah, but you can't be so sure of that, can you? Said Cedric. Lucy Icebarrow looked at him with some interest. She had already been intrigued by the rather startling differences between the three brothers. Cedric was a big man with a weather-beaten, rugged face, unkempt dark hair, and a jocund manner. He had arrived from the airport unshaven, and though he had shaved in preparation for the inquest, he was still wearing the clothes in which he had arrived and which seemed to be the only ones he had. Old grey flannel trousers and a patched and rather threadbare baggy jacket. He looked stage bohemian to the life and proud of it. His brother Harold, on the contrary, was the perfect picture of a city gentleman and a director of important companies. He was tall, with a neat, erect carriage, had dark hair going slightly bald on the temples, a small black moustache, and was impeccably dressed in a dark, well-cut suit and a pearl grey tie. He looked what he was, a shrewd and successful businessman. He now said stiffly, Really, Cedric, that seems a most uncalled for remark. Don't see why. She was in our barn after all. What did she come there for? Mr. Wimborne coughed and said, Possibly some assignation? I understand that it was a matter of local knowledge that the key was kept outside on the nail. His tone indicated outrage at the carelessness of such procedure. So clearly marked was this that Emma spoke apologetically. It started during the war for the ARP wardens. There was a little spirit stove and they made themselves hot cocoa. And afterwards, since there was really nothing there anybody could have wanted to take, we went on leaving the key hanging up. It was convenient for the Women's Institute people. If we kept it in the house, it might have been awkward when there was no one at home to give it them when they wanted it to get the place ready, with only daily women and no resident servants. Her voice trailed away. She had spoken mechanically, giving a wordy explanation without interest, as though her mind was elsewhere. Cedric gave her a quick, puzzled glance. "You're worried, sis. What's up?" Harold spoke with aspiration. "Really, Cedric, can you ask?" "Yes, I do ask. Granted, a strange young woman has got herself killed in the barn at Rutherford Hall, and granted it gave Emma a shock at the time, but Emma's always been a sensible girl. I don't see why she goes on being worried now. Dash it, one gets used to everything." "Murder takes a little more getting used to by some people than it may in your case," said Harold acidly. "I dare say murders are 2 a penny in Mallorca and Ibiza, not Mallorca. It's the same thing." "Not at all. It's quite a different island." Harold went on talking. "My point is that though murder may be an everyday commonplace to you, living amongst hot-blooded Latin people, nevertheless in England, we take such things seriously." He added with increasing irritation, "And really, Cedric, to appear at a public inquest in those clothes." "What's wrong with my clothes? They're comfortable." "They're unsuitable." "Well, anyway, they are the only clothes I've got with me. I didn't pack my wardrobe trunk when I came rushing home to stand in with the family over this business. I'm a painter, and painters like to be comfortable in their clothes." "So you're still trying to paint?" "Look here, Harold, when you say trying to paint..." Mr. Wimborne cleared his throat in an authoritative manner. "This discussion is unprofitable," he said reprovingly. "I hope, my dear Emma, that you will tell me if there is any further way in which I can be of service to you before I return to town." The reproof had its effect. Emma Crackenthorpe said quickly, "It was most kind of you to come down." "Not at all. It was advisable that someone should be at the inquest to watch the proceedings on behalf of the family. I have arranged for an interview with the inspector at the house. I have no doubt that, distressing as all this has been, the situation will soon be clarified. In my own mind, there seems little doubt as to what occurred. As Emma has told us, the key to the long barn was known locally to hang outside the door. It seems highly probable that the place was used in the winter months as a place of assignation by local couples. No doubt there was a quarrel and some young man lost control of himself. Horrified at what he had done, his eye lit on the sarcophagus and he realized that it would make an excellent place of concealment. Lucy thought to herself, "Yes, it sounds most plausible. That's just what one might think." Cedric said, "You say a local couple, but nobody's been able to identify the girl locally." "It's early days yet. No doubt we shall get an identification before long. And it is possible, of course, that the man in question was a local resident, but that the girl came from elsewhere, perhaps from some other part of Brackhampton. Brackhampton's a big place. It's grown enormously in the last 20 years. If I were a girl coming to meet my young man, I'd not stand for being taken to a freezing old cold barn miles from anywhere," Cedric objected. "I'd stand out for a nice bit of cuddle in the cinema. Won't you, Miss Irisborough?" "Do we need to go into all this?" Harold demanded plaintively. And with the voicing of the question, the car drew up before the front door of Rutherford Hall, and they all got out. 咁呢一節就完啦，第7節。咁呢度就終於就集齊咗呢個 Crackenthorpe 嘅第2代啦，有呢個二仔啊 Harold 啦，大仔已經喺大戰度過咗身啦。二仔 Harold 啦，一個事業型嘅男士啦，比較冷漠啲啦，無禮啲啦，直率啲啦。跟住就三仔啦，Cedric 啦，就係一個畫家啦，身材高大啦，咁亦都係喺海外翻嚟㗎啦。跟住有 Emma 啦，一路都喺度㗎啦，一路都留喺大宅，一路都冇嫁出去嘅 一個都受到尊重嘅一個角色嚟嘅，因為佢照顧即係年老嘅父親啦。咁啊，仲有 Alfred， 但係 Alfred 就未翻嚟。咁於是乎咧，就仲有一個嘅，就係佢哋嘅女婿啦，入贅嘅女婿啦，就係呢個Bryan Beasley 啦。咁但係 Bryan Beasley 啱啱咧就冇加入呢一個對話嘅，因為佢就係唔喺呢架車入面嘅，佢就自己揸咗另外一架車嘅咁樣。Alfred 係喺度嘅 ，Alfred 喺度嘅，但係 Alfred 咧都係同阿 Bryan 咧就坐另外一架車，係啦。咁所以頭先嗰個對話就冇 Alfred， 咁變咗個對話就集中咗喺年長嗰兩個哥哥身上啦，主要係咁樣。咁啊，當然仲有交代呢個律師啦 ，Mr. Wimborne 啦。咁啊，佢都係一個好典型嘅家庭律師啦，都係德高望重嘅，同埋都有一個資格去停止佢哋嘅所謂爭拗啦，咁樣樣。咁人物介紹嘅階段啦，呢一個係咁，當然佢哋全部都係疑犯啦。咁其實都係介紹疑犯啦。不過喺呢一秒鐘，我覺得我自己判斷啦，即係 Harold 同埋 Cedric 都唔似係兇手咯。但係同呢個死者有冇關係就唔敢講，但係呢一刻就真係唔似啦咁樣。我哋睇下有啲乜嘢字先。有啊，一開始呢個章節就有一個 stolid 就形容呢個Chief Constable 嘅意思，即係一個好平靜啦，一個可靠啦，一個唔表現出佢嘅感情嘅，又或者唔會點樣喐動佢嘅身體，即係唔會點樣好生動咁樣去喐動佢嘅肢體嘅人啦 ，stolid 啦，輕輕有少少褒義嘅輕輕啦，即係一個平靜嘅人啦咁咯。rigmarole 呢個字我自己都第一次見。rigmarole 係中文就解冗長一個 long rambling story 一個 statement。rigmarole 就係佢文中有講啦，即係話當初佢哋對喺火車上面目擊殺人案嘅嗰個 statement 啦 rigmarole 即係覺得好長篇大論啦咁樣。係比較貶義啲嘅，係一個貶義啲嘅字嚟。OK， 咁今日就講呢兩個字先 ，stolid rigmarole。咁下一次嘅第8章再見啦，拜拜。大家好啊！
大家好。又
到咗讀你聽嘅時間啦。我哋今日咧就繼續讀我哋 A.Christie 嘅 450 from Paddington 咁由於而家都係晚上啦、夜深啦，咁未到11點嘅，不過都夜深啦，係咪？
係啊。
咁我太太就有啲眼瞓啦，不過都當係一個 bedtime story 咁啦，係嘛？咁故事咧就發展到 chapter 8啦，第8節啦。咁發生咗咩事咧？就係發現咗女屍啦。女屍咧就 Lucy 發現咗女屍喺呢個 Sutherland Hall 呢個莊園入面嘅一個木屋入面嘅一個石棺入面。咁咧莊園入面嘅主人啦，仲有其他嘅住喺度嘅家族成員啦，都先後去睇過個屍體，亦都見過一啲警察啦，咁樣。咁而家接落嚟咧，就係去繼續去跟進呢件案件啦。警方係咪？咁呢一節咧就係講警方跟進事件啊，好冇？
好。
發現咗女屍之後，警方跟進事件啦。OK， 所有關鍵嘅證人都會落口供。其實即係對於兇手係邊個作為一個線索咧，都幾緊要㗎。應該可以參考下。如果有興趣想估邊個兇手嘅話，開始啦。Chapter 8. On entering the library, Mr. Wimborne blinked a little as his shrewd old eyes went past Inspector Bacon, whom he had already met, to the fair-haired, good-looking man beyond him. Inspector Bacon performed introductions. This is Detective Inspector Craddock of New Scotland Yard, he said. New Scotland Yard. Mr. Wimborne's eyebrows rose. Dermot Craddock, who had a pleasant manner, went easily into speech. We have been called in on a case, Mr. Wimborne, he said. As you are representing the Crackenthorpe family, I feel it is only fair that we should give you a little confidential information. Nobody could make a better show of presenting a very small portion of the truth and implying that it was the whole truth than Inspector Craddock. Inspector Bacon will agree, I am sure, he added, glancing at his colleague. Inspector Bacon agreed with all due solemnity and not at all as though the whole matter was prearranged. It's like this, said Craddock. We have reason to believe, from information that has come into our possession, that the dead woman is not a native of these parts, that she travelled down here from London, and that she had recently come from abroad, probably from France. Mr. Wimborne again raised his eyebrows. Indeed, he said. Indeed? That being the case, explained Inspector Bacon, the Chief Constable felt that the Yard was better fitted to investigate the matter. I can only hope, said Mr. Wimborne, that the case will be solved quickly. As you can no doubt appreciate, the whole business has been a source of much distress to the family, although not personally concerned in any way they are. He paused for a bare second, but Inspector Craddock filled the gap quickly. It's not a pleasant thing to find a murdered woman on your property. I couldn't agree with you more. Now I should like to have a brief interview with the various members of the family. I really cannot see what they can tell me. Probably nothing of interest, but one never knows. I dare say I can get most of the information I want from you, sir. Information about this house and the family. And what can that possibly have to do with an unknown young woman coming from abroad and getting herself killed here? Well, that's rather the point, said Craddock. Why did she come here? Had she once had some connection with this house? Had she been, for instance, a servant here at one time? A lady's maid, perhaps? Or did she come here to meet a former occupant of Rutherford Hall? Mr. Wimborne said coldly that Rutherford Hall had been occupied by the Crackenthorpes ever since Josiah Crackenthorpe built it in 1884. That's interesting in itself, said Craddock, if you just give me a brief outline of the family history. Mr. Wimborne shrugged his shoulders. This is very little to tell. Josiah Crackenthorpe was a manufacturer of sweet and savory biscuits, radishes, pickles, etc. He accumulated a vast fortune. He built his house. Luther Crackenthorpe, his eldest son, lives here now. Any other sons? One other son, Henry, who was killed in a motor accident in 1911. And the present Mr. Crackenthorpe has never thought of selling the house? He is unable to do so, said the lawyer dryly, by the terms of his father's will. Perhaps you'll tell me about the will? Why should I? Inspector Craddock smiled. Because I can look it up myself if I want to, at Somerset House. Against his will, Mr. Wimborne gave a crabbed little smile. Quite right, Inspector. I was merely protesting that the information you asked for is quite irrelevant. As to Josiah Crackenthorpe's will, there is no mystery about it. He left his very considerable fortune in trust. The income from it
to be paid to his son, Luther, for life, and after Luther's death, the capital to be divided equally between Luther's children, Edmund, Cedric, Harold, Alfred, Emma, and Edith. Edmund was killed in the war, and Edith died 4 years ago, so that on Luther Crackenthorpe's decease, the money will be divided between Cedric, Harold, Alfred, Emma, and Edith's son, Alexander Easley. And the house, that will go to Luther Crackenthorpe's eldest surviving son, or his issue. Was Edmund Crackenthorpe married? No. So the property will go to the next son, Cedric. Mr. Luther Crackenthorpe himself cannot dispose of it? No. And he has no control of the capital? No. Isn't that rather unusual, I suppose, said Inspector Craddock shrewdly, that his father didn't like him? You suppose correctly, said Mr. Wimborne. Old Josiah was disappointed that his eldest son showed no interest in the family business, or indeed in business of any kind. Luther spent his time traveling abroad and collecting objects of art. Old Josiah was very unsympathetic to that kind of thing, so he left his money in trust for the next generation. But in the meantime, the next generation have no income except that they make or what their father allows them, and their father has a considerable income, but no power of it dispose of the capital. Exactly. And what all this has to do with the murder of an unknown young woman of foreign origin, I cannot imagine. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with it, Inspector Craddock agreed promptly. I just wanted to ascertain all the facts. Mr. Wimborne looked at him sharply, then, seemingly satisfied with the result of his scrutiny, rose to his feet. I am proposing now to return to London, he said, unless there is anything further you wish to know. He looked from one man to the other. No, thank you, sir. The sound of the gong rose fortissimo from the hall outside. Dear me, said Mr. Wimborne, one of the boys, I think, must have been performing. Inspector Craddock raised his voice to be heard above the clamour as he said, We'll leave the family to have lunch in peace, but Inspector Bacon and I would like to return after it, say at 2:15, and have a short interview with every member of the family. You think that is necessary? Well, Craddock shrugged his shoulders. It's just an off chance. Somebody might remember something that would give us a clue to the woman's identity. I doubt it, Inspector. I doubt it very much. But I wish you good luck. As I said just now, the sooner this distasteful business is cleared up, the better for everybody. Shaking his head, he went slowly out of the room. Lucy had gone straight to the kitchen on getting back from the inquest, and was busy with preparations for lunch when Bryan Easley put his head in. Can I give you a hand in any way? He asked. I'm handy about the house. Lucy gave him a quick, slightly preoccupied glance. Bryan had arrived in the inquest direct in his small MG car, and she had not as yet had much time to size him up. What she saw was likable enough. Easley was an amiable-looking young man of 30-odd with brown hair, rather plaintive blue eyes, and an enormous fair moustache. The boys aren't back yet, he said, coming in and sitting on the end of the kitchen table. It will take him another 20 minutes on their bikes. Lucy smiled. They were certainly determined not to miss anything. Can't blame them, I mean to say. First inquest in their young lives and right in the family, so to speak. Do you mind getting off the table, Mr. Easty? I want to put the baking dish down there. Bryan obeyed. I say, that fat's cooking hot. That fat's cooking hot. What are you going to put in it? Yorkshire pudding. Good old Yorkshire. Roast beef of old England. Is that the menu for today? Yes. The funeral baked meats, in fact. Smells good. He sniffed appreciatively. Do you mind my guessing away? If you came in to help, I'd rather you helped. She drew another pan from the oven. Here, turn all these potatoes over so that they brown on the other side. Bryan obeyed with alacrity. Have all these things been fizzling away in here while we've been in the inquest? supposing they've been all burnt up. Most improbable. There's a regulating number on the oven. Kind of electric brain. What? Is that right? Lucy threw a swift look in his direction. Quite right. Now put the pan in the oven. Here, take the cloth. On the second shelf. I want the top for the Yorkshire pudding. Bryan obeyed, but not without uttering a shrill yelp. Burn yourself? Just a bit. It doesn't matter. A dangerous game cooking is. I suppose you never do your own cooking. As a matter of fact, I do, quite often. But not this sort of thing. I can boil an egg, if I don't forget to look at the clock. And I can do eggs and bacon. And I can put a steak under the grill or open a tin of soup. I've got one of those little electric whatnots in my flat. You live in London? If you call it living, yes. His tone was despondent. He watched Lucy shoot in the dish with the Yorkshire pudding mixture. This is awfully jolly, he said inside. Her immediate preoccupations over, Lucy looked at him with more attention. What is this kitchen? Yes, reminds me of our kitchen at home when I was a boy. It struck Lucy that there was something strangely forlorn about Bryan Easley. Looking closely at him, she realized that he was older than she had at first thought. He must be close on 40. It seemed difficult to think of him as Alexander's father. He reminded her of innumerable young pilots she had known during the war when she had been at the impressionable age of 14. She had gone on and grown up into a post-war world, but she felt as though Bryan had not gone on, but had been passed by in the passage of years. His next words confirmed this. He had subsided on the kitchen table again. It's a difficult sort of world, he said, isn't it? To get your bearings in, I mean. You see, one hasn't been trained for it. Lucy recalled what she had heard from Emma. You were a fighter pilot, weren't you? She said. You've got a DFC. That's the sort of thing that puts you wrong. You've got a gong, and so people try to make it easy for you, give you a job and all that. Very decent of them, but they are all admin jobs, and one simply isn't any good at that sort of thing. Sitting at a desk, getting tangled up in figures. I've had ideas of my own, tried out a wheeze or two, but you can't get the backing. Can't get the chaps to come in and put down the money. If I had a bit of capital. He brooded. You didn't know Eddie, did you? My wife? No, of course you didn't. She was quite different from all this lot. Younger, for one thing. She was in the WAAF. She always said her old man was crackers. He is, mean as hell for money. And it's not as though he could take it with him. It's got to be divided up when he dies. Eddie's share will go to Alexander, of course. He won't be able to touch the capital until he's 21, though. I'm sorry, but will you get off the table again? I want to dish up and make gravy. At that moment, Alexander and Stoddard West arrived with rosy faces and very much out of breath. Hello, Bryan, said Alexander kindly to his father. So this is where you've got to. I say, what a smashing piece of beef. Is there Yorkshire pudding? Yes, there is. We have awful Yorkshire pudding at school, all damp and limp. Get out of my way, said Lucy. I want to make the gravy. Make lots of gravy. Can we have 2 sauce boats full? Yes. Good-o, said Stoddard West, pronouncing the word carefully. I don't like it pale, said Alexander anxiously. It won't be pale. She's a smashing cook, said Alexander to his father. Lucy had a momentary impression that their roles were reversed. Alexander spoke like a kindly father to his son. Can we help you, Miss Irisbarrow? Asked Stoddard West politely. Yes, you can, Alexander. Go and sound the gong. James, will you carry this tray into the dining room, and will you take the joint in, Mr. Easley? I'll bring the potatoes and the Yorkshire pudding. There's a Scotland Yard man here, said Alexander. Do you think he'll have lunch with us? That depends on what your aunt arranged. I don't suppose Aunt Emma would mind. She's very hospitable. But I suppose Uncle Harold wouldn't like it. He's being very sticky over this murder. Alexander went out through the door with the tray, adding a little additional information over his shoulder. Mr. Wimborne's in the library with the Scotland Yard man now, but he isn't staying to lunch. He said he had to get back to London. Come on, Stodders. Oh, he's gone to do the gong. At that moment, the gong took charge. Stoddard West was an artist. He gave it everything he had, and all further conversation was inhibited. Bryan carried in the joint. Lucy followed with vegetables, returning to the kitchen to get the 2 brimming sauce bowls of gravy. Mr. Wimborne was standing in the hall, putting on his gloves as Emma came quickly down the stairs. Are you really sure you won't stop for lunch, Mr. Wimborne? It's all ready. No, I have an important appointment in London. There is a restaurant car on the train. It was very good of you to come down, said Emma gratefully. The 2 police officers emerged from the library. Mr. Wimborne took Emma's hand in his. There's nothing to worry about, my dear, he said. This is Detective Inspector Craddock from New Scotland Yard, who has come to take charge of the case. He is coming back at 2:15 to ask you for any facts that may assist him in his inquiry. But, as I say, you have nothing to worry about. He looked towards Craddock. I may repeat to Miss Crackenthorpe what you have told me? Certainly, sir. Inspector Craddock has just told me that this almost certainly was not a local crime. The murdered woman is thought to have come from London and was probably a foreigner. Emma Crackenthorpe said sharply, a foreigner? Was she French? Mr. Wimborne had clearly meant his statement to be consoling. He looked slightly taken aback. Dermot Craddock's glance went quickly from him to Emma's face. He wondered why she had leaped to the conclusion that the murdered woman was French, and why that thought disturbed her so much.
讀到呢度為止啦。嗰個疑點咧又再一次落翻喺阿 Emma 身上啦。即係點解佢會對呢一個女人即係作為一個外國人咁敏感咧？即係會直接就問呢個女人係唔係法國人啊？咁樣有疑點嘅。咁就另一方面咧，就係呢個家庭成員開始逐一出現啦，係咪？咁比較有趣嘅似乎就係呢個 Bryan Easley。Bryan Easley 係邊個咧？就係呢一個 Edith 嘅老公啦。咁Edith咧就已經過咗身㗎啦。Edith 就係 Emma 嘅妹啦。咁4年前過咗身啦，喺呢一章節有交代到。咁呢個 Bryan 咧就30幾40歲啦，咁亦都係呢個 Master Alexander 嘅爸爸啦。咁但係呢個 Bryan Easley 似乎俾人嘅感覺就係有啲玩世不恭啦，同埋就係即係唔算話唔可以話佢好能幹啦，同埋個感覺就係似乎佢個仔 Alexander 仲成熟穩重過佢自己喎，咁難免俾人一種即係唔係好可靠嘅感覺。咁但係呢個 Bryan 咧都係好樣嘅，即係如果唔係Lucy 都唔會同佢傾偈咁樣。咁但係好明顯 Lucy 都對佢嗰個興趣不大啊 ，feel 到。咁仲有啲咩咧？基本上係咁啦，就係陸續介紹家庭成員啦，家庭成員會翻嚟啦，同埋即係呢個 Crackenthorpe 家族嘅律師啦，私人律師啦。咁呢個 Wimborne 啦，不過就暫時嗰個關鍵性不大嘅，同埋佢都翻去倫敦啦咁樣。仲有就大概係咁先啦，我哋下一次再睇下個故事發展啦。臨走之前咧都有幾個字同大家分享下啦。第一個字就係 inquest 個內文有提到嘅，即係呢一個 inquest 就係基本上就係一個 聆訊啦，或者一個問話啦嚇。咁通常都係喺英文嚟講咧，英國嘅英文嚟講咧就同呢一個死因聆訊係有關係嘅嚇。咁但係喺呢一度咧，喺呢一個故事入面咧就問話啦，我哋嘅翻譯可以叫做問話啦，咁樣 inquest。之後咧就一個形容詞啦 ，sententious。呢一句應該係嗰兩個差人講嘅，應該係 Credit 講嘅，即係佢希望去激勵佢哋差人嘅士氣，即係話，我相信我哋可以好快破案嘅sententious 激勵士氣，通常都係講嗰陣時候會有一種激昂喺度啦，有一種激動喺度啦，咁通常都係為咗提升士氣嘅作用。最後就俾多個字啦 ，plaintiff 啦，呢個比較常用啲 plaintiff。佢用 plaintiff 嚟形容呢個 Bryan Easley 對眼嘅Bryan Easley 對眼嘅，話佢幾好樣嘅，但係佢有個眼好 plaintiff。咁plaintiff 咧意思即係好 sad 嘅，悲傷嘅 ，mournful 嘅，有啲悲傷，有啲悲同一種淡淡嘅哀愁感啦，咁用嚟形容呢個 Bryan Easley 對眼嘅。OK， 咁今日就講到呢度啦，我哋下次再講啦。老婆瞓咗覺未啊？
瞓咗。
好啦，我哋下次繼續啦，拜拜。